Gunshots echoed through the stormy night. Maxwell Max Colton bolted upright in his bed, the old war instinct still sharp as a razor. Another crack of thunder, or was it another shot? His weathered hands gripped the Colt Peacemaker with the familiarity of a man who'd seen too many battles, both on and off the battlefield. The scars across his knuckles caught the lightning flash that illuminated his stern face, deep-set eyes scanning the darkness with predatory focus. Moving toward the window, Max's muscular frame cast a shadow against the rain-lashed glass. That's when he saw her, a slip of a girl, no more than 16 or 17, standing at his porch steps. Even through the rain, he could see the revolver dangling from her trembling hand. Blood soaked her tattered dress, plastering it against her thin frame. Their eyes met through the glass, and Max saw something in those pale blue eyes that sent a chill down his spine. Not fear, though there was plenty of that. Not desperation, though that was there too. No, what struck him was the emptiness, the look of someone who'd seen the devil himself and survived to carry the mark. Some wounds can't be seen, and some stories can't be told with words. But that night, when that mute girl with the blood-soaked gun appeared on my doorstep, fate had just dealt me a hand that would either save us both or get us both killed. Doc Jenkins wiped his hands on a stained towel, shaking his head as he looked down at the girl. She sat motionless on Max's kitchen chair, eyes following every movement in the room, but her mouth remained stubbornly closed. "She can't speak," Doc finally declared. "Trauma, most likely. Seen it before during the war. Some things silence a person quicker than cutting their vocal cords." Sheriff Wilson adjusted his hat, glancing nervously at the girl. "Can't keep her here, Max. County'll take her to the poorhouse in Millerville. They've got proper facilities for damaged ones." The word hung in the air like gun smoke. Damaged. Max felt something twist in his chest, the same feeling he'd carried for 3 years since Elizabeth's fever took her, the same feeling that made him avoid the locked room upstairs where dust gathered on ivory keys. "She ain't damaged," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his 45 years. "She's hurt. There's a difference." The girl's head turned toward him, those pale eyes focusing with sudden intensity. For just a moment, Max saw something flicker there. Recognition, maybe. Or hope. Then it was gone, hidden behind the terrible silence. "Max, you can't," the sheriff started, his mustache twitching with disapproval. "My land, my choice." Max stepped closer to the girl, and surprisingly, she didn't flinch. That told him something. Most traumatized folks couldn't stand being near strangers, especially men. She stays until she's ready to leave. The silence stretched between them all, broken only by the tick of Elizabeth's old clock on the mantel. The girl's eyes never left his face, searching for something he couldn't name. Outside, his cattle lowed in the distance, and somewhere in the house, a loose shutter knocked against weathered wood. Doc Jenkins shook his head. "Max, if she can't speak, how's she going to tell you what she needs? What happened to her?" Max looked at the girl again, noting how she held herself, careful, controlled, like someone listening for danger that might never stop coming. "Sometimes," he said, "words ain't the only way to tell a story." After the doctor and sheriff left, Max showed the girl. He'd started thinking of her as Becky, though he didn't know why. To Elizabeth's sewing room off the kitchen. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a window that faced east toward the mountains. "You can stay here," he said, awkward in the face of her silence. "I'll be upstairs if you need anything. Just—" He paused, realizing the absurdity. "Just knock, I guess." She stood in the middle of the room, still as a deer catching a predator's scent, until Max backed away and closed the door. That night, lying in bed, listening to the last of the storm roll away across the plains, Max questioned his decision. A stranger in his house, a girl with blood on her clothes and ghosts in her eyes. The Winchester rifle leaned against his bedside table, loaded and ready, just in case. As he checked the rifle's action, memories of another battle flooded back. Not the war, but that night 5 years ago when rustlers had tried to take his herd. He'd killed then 3 men who thought a widower's ranch was easy pickings. He still remembered the weight of the bodies as he'd dragged them to shallow graves in the creek bed. He'd killed then, and he would kill again if necessary. Sleep eventually came, and when he woke at dawn, she was still there. He found her in the kitchen, somehow managing to cook eggs and bacon without making a sound. Her hair was damp. She must have found the wash basin, and she changed into an old shirt and pants he kept in the mudroom for ranch hands. They ate in silence, but it wasn't as uncomfortable as it should have been. When he rose to head out to the barn, she stood too, following him like a shadow. "You don't need to work," he said, stopping at the door. "You're a guest." She shook her head firmly, pointing to the barn and then to herself. "Suit yourself," Max shrugged, secretly relieved. He'd never been good at making conversation, even with people who could talk back. The first week passed in careful circles around each other, but with each passing day, Max noticed something. The girl wasn't just surviving, she was adapting. She moved through the ranch with growing confidence, her hands finding purpose in every task. On the 5th day, Max returned to find Becky in the corral, standing motionless as his most temperamental stallion pawed the ground just feet away. Before he could shout a warning, she stepped forward, whispered something, though no sound came out. And the beast, who'd thrown every ranch hand who'd ever tried to ride him, lowered his head in submission. Word spread quickly in a small Wyoming town. By Sunday, Mrs. Patterson was waiting for Max after church, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Folks are talking, Maxwell," she announced, cornering him outside the white clapboard building. "Decent man like you, keeping a strange girl without proper supervision. It don't look right." Max adjusted his hat, feeling the weight of every stare from the congregation. "What's proper about sending a hurt child to rot in some county facility? She could be dangerous, Max. Could be simple-minded, or worse. You don't know nothing about her." But that wasn't entirely true. He'd learned things in their wordless coexistence. The girl knew how to tend animals. He'd found her in the barn one morning, calming his spooked mare with gentle hands. She could mend. His torn work shirt had appeared on his bedroom door, stitched with neat, careful threads. And she was educated. He'd caught her reading Elizabeth's books, her lips moving silently as her finger traced the words. Most surprising of all, he'd found her one morning at Elizabeth's desk, writing in perfect flowing script. A list of supplies the ranch needed, along with calculations for how much feed would last through winter. Her math was flawless. "She ain't dangerous," he told Mrs. Patterson. "She's just quiet." But doubt crept in during the long evenings. The girl would sit on the porch steps while he worked in the barn, and sometimes he'd feel her watching him with those pale eyes that seemed to hold secrets he couldn't fathom. What if the townspeople were right? What if his loneliness had clouded his judgment? The question answered itself on a Thursday evening when he came home to find his front door standing open. His heart hammered as he called out, but silence answered him. Then he heard it, a crash from the kitchen, followed by what sounded like crying. He found Becky crouched beside Elizabeth's china cabinet, trying to gather pieces of a broken serving bowl. Blood dripped from her palm where a shard had cut deep, and her shoulders shook with silent sobs that tore at something inside his chest. "Hey now," he said, kneeling beside her. "It's all right. It's just a bowl." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, and her mouth opened as if she might speak. But no sound came. Just that heartbreaking attempt at words that wouldn't form. She pointed frantically at the broken pieces, then at herself, her face crumpled with guilt and shame. "Accidents happen," Max said gently, taking her bleeding hand in his. "Elizabeth broke that same bowl twice, First time was the day after we married, and the second was when she threw it at my head during an argument about buying more cattle. The girl's eyes widened slightly, and he thought he saw the ghost of a smile. She missed both times, he added, and began carefully picking china from her palm. Woman couldn't hit the broad side of a barn. Lucky for me, or I wouldn't be sitting here. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began pattering against the windows. Becky glanced nervously at the darkening sky. Storm's coming back, Max observed. Better get the animals settled. That night, after bandaging her hand and sharing a quiet supper, Max found himself telling her about Elizabeth, about their 15 years together, about the fever that took her 3 winters past, about the piano upstairs that hadn't been played since. Becky listened, her eyes never leaving his face, and Max realized it was the most he'd spoken at once in 3 years. Maybe it was easier talking to someone who couldn't interrupt. Or maybe it was just time. The next morning, Max took Becky into town for supplies. He needed grain for the horses and ammunition for winter hunting. She needed proper clothes. His old work shirts and pants were practical, but drew even more stares than her silence. Millerville wasn't much. A single dirt street lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon, the bank, and a handful of other establishments clinging to existence on the edge of the Wyoming wilderness. But it was civilization of a sort, and Max watched Becky drink it in with wary eyes. "Morning, Max," Sam Wheeler called from the general store porch. His curious gaze lingered on Becky. "This the girl folks been talking about?" Max nodded curtly. "Rebecca Daniels. She's working at my place for a spell." The name had come to him that morning, and Becky hadn't objected when he'd written it down and showed it to her. Rebecca seemed too formal for the slight, solemn girl, so Becky she became. Inside the store, Mrs. Wheeler fussed over the girl, helping her select sturdy work dresses and proper boots. Max pretended to be absorbed in examining ammunition while keeping an eye on Becky. She seemed overwhelmed by the attention but handled it with quiet dignity. "Poor dear," Mrs. Wheeler whispered to Max as she tallied their purchases. "Sheriff Wilson told us she can't speak. Is it true?" Before Max could answer, the store's bell jangled as Billy Thompson swaggered in with 2 friends. The banker's son, 20 years old and full of his own importance, stopped short when he saw Becky. "Well, look here," he drawled, nudging his companions. "It's Colton's mute charity case." His eyes traveled over Becky in a way that made Max's hand instinctively move toward his holster. "That's enough, Billy," Mrs. Wheeler said sharply. "You boys go on about your business." Billy ignored her, stepping closer to Becky, who had gone still as stone. "They say you can't talk, girl. Cat got your tongue? Or are you just simple?" Max moved between them, his face hardening. "Back off, Thompson." Billy's smirk widened. "No offense meant, Colton. Just being neighborly. Maybe she needs a different kind of company to loosen her up. Young company." Max felt the old familiar heat rising in his chest, the same anger that had gotten him into trouble more times than he could count. In one fluid motion, he grabbed Billy by the collar, lifting him nearly off his feet. "Listen close, boy. 'Cause I'm only saying this once," Max growled, his voice low enough that only Billy could hear. "You come near her, you look at her wrong, you even think about her, and they'll find pieces of you from here to Cheyenne. Understand?" Billy's face went white, then red with humiliation as Max set him back down. "You've made a mistake, old man," he hissed, straightening his collar. Your father knows what you are." Max cut him off. "Now get." After they left, Mrs. Wheeler sighed. "Don't mind Billy. He's had a mean streak since his mama passed. Mr. Thompson spoils him something terrible." Max nodded, but the encounter left him uneasy. He watched Becky more closely as they finished their shopping, noting how her shoulders had tensed, how her eyes now darted to every doorway, every corner. They were nearly back to the wagon when Becky froze, staring at something on the sheriff's office wall. Max followed her gaze to a row of wanted posters. She was looking at one in particular, a crude sketch of a young woman with the name Jessica Harmon printed beneath it. The reward was $500 and the charges were murder and theft. The resemblance wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to send a chill down Max's spine. He glanced at Becky, whose face had gone white as flour. "Let's get home," he said quietly, not acknowledging what he'd seen. "Storm's brewing again." They rode back to the ranch in silence, the wagon wheels creaking a lonely rhythm across the prairie. Max didn't ask, and Becky didn't offer any explanation. But that night he checked his rifle and pistol and slept with the Colt under his pillow. When he came in from morning chores the next day, he found Becky packing a small bundle, the few clothes they'd bought, some food from the pantry. She looked up when he entered, her eyes both defiant and pleading. "You saw the poster," Max said simply. She nodded, her fingers twisting anxiously in the fabric of her new dress. "You running because you're guilty or because you're scared?" Becky hesitated, then pointed to her throat, frustration evident in every line of her body. Max sighed, then went to Elizabeth's desk and returned with paper and pencil. "Here," he said, "if you can read and write like I've seen you do, you can tell me what's happening." Her handwriting was neat and educated, confirming what he'd suspected. She wrote quickly, urgently, "I need to leave. They're looking for me. It's not safe for you." "Who's looking for you?" She wrote again. "Bad men. They'll say they're lawmen, but they're not. They're killers. And are you a killer?" Her hand trembled as she wrote, "Yes, but they deserved it." Max stared at the words for a long moment. He thought of the bruises that had marked her arms when she arrived, the haunted look in her eyes, the way she startled at sudden movements. Something had happened to this girl, something terrible enough to take her voice and turn her into a killer. "Don't run," he said finally, "at least not until I know the truth." They came with the next storm, 3 riders pushing hard through rain that turned the world gray and violent. Max saw them from the barn where he'd been checking on the horses. Becky had taken to helping with evening chores, moving through tasks with quiet efficiency that reminded him of Elizabeth's practical grace. "Get behind me," he murmured, and she nodded once, sharp and frightened. The riders dismounted in his yard, water streaming from their hat brims. The leader was a big man with graying whiskers and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite with a dull knife. A long scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, pulling his mouth into a permanent sneer. A badge gleamed dully on his vest, U.S. Marshal, which meant trouble that reached beyond county lines. "Marshal Walter Blackwood," the man announced, not bothering with pleasantries. His voice matched his face, hard, rough, and dangerous. "We're looking for a fugitive." "What fugitive?" Max kept his voice level, but his hand drifted toward the pistol on his hip. "Don't play stupid." "Colton," Blackwood snapped. "The girl who killed 3 men in Cheyenne and ran off with $5,000 in bank money." Behind him, Max heard Becky's sharp intake of breath. He didn't turn around, didn't let his face change, but something cold settled in his stomach. Murder, theft, the words echoed in his head like hammer blows. "Ain't no killer here," he said. "Just me and my cattle." Blackwood smiled without warmth. "That's so. Then you won't mind if we search your property." He gestured to his men, who began spreading out. "Girl goes by the name Jessica Harmon," Blackwood continued, his eyes scanning the barn. 16 years old, dark hair, can't speak a word on account of being born simple. Makes her real useful for certain types of work, if you catch my meaning. Something in the way he said it made Max's blood run cold. He'd heard of men who trafficked in young women, selling them to mining camps and worse places. Was that what had happened to Becky? Max felt rather than saw Becky move behind him, and suddenly she was beside him, stepping into the light. Rain had soaked through her dress and her hair hung in dark ribbons around her face, but she stood straight and defiant despite the terror in her eyes. "Well, well," Blackwood said, his smile growing wider. "There's our little songbird." Becky's mouth opened then, and Max thought for a moment she might speak. Instead, she lifted her chin and stared at Blackwood with naked hatred that made the marshal's smile falter. Thunder crashed overhead, and in the sudden silence that followed, Max heard Elizabeth's voice as clear as if she was standing beside him. "Sometimes the right choice ain't the legal choice. Max, sometimes you gotta choose between law and justice, and they ain't always the same thing." Lightning flickered again, casting everything in stark black and white. The girl beside him, the marshal with his hand on his gun, the choice hanging in the air like the smell of rain and electricity. "You're on my land," Max said quietly, "and I'm asking you to leave." Blackwood's face darkened. "You harboring a fugitive now, Colton? That's a hanging offense." "I'm harboring nobody. This is Rebecca Daniels, my hired help. Now, unless you've got a warrant with that fancy badge, you can ride out the way you came in." The standoff lasted 10 heartbeats, neither man willing to back down. Finally, Blackwood spat into the dirt. "Come sunup, we'll be back with papers from the territorial judge. You can hand her over peaceful, or we can do this the hard way." "Your choice," Max replied, his hand still resting on his pistol. The three men mounted up and rode back into the storm, but Max had no illusions. They wouldn't go far. Probably camp just beyond his property line, waiting for dawn. Once they were out of sight, Becky's composure cracked. She sagged against the barn wall, her entire body trembling. Max led her back to the house through the driving rain, both of them soaked to the skin by the time they reached the porch. Inside, Max built up the fire while Becky changed into dry clothes. When she returned, he had coffee brewing and a bottle of whiskey on the table. He poured a small amount into her cup, then a larger one into his own. "Medicinal," he explained, pushing her cup toward her. "Now, I reckon it's time for the whole story." Becky's hands shook as she reached for the paper and pencil, but her writing was still neat, determined. "They killed my family. All of them. Made me watch." The words hit Max like a physical blow. He'd suspected something terrible. But this? Blackwood and his men? She nodded, writing again. "They're not marshals. They're outlaws. My father was a banker in Denver. They robbed his bank, then followed him home. When they found out he'd recognized Blackwood, they killed everyone. My parents, my little brother." Max swallowed hard. "But not you." "Blackwood said I was pretty, said I'd fetch a good price in certain establishments. They kept me for 4 months, did things—" Her pencil faltered, then continued. "I stopped talking the first night. The words just disappeared. They thought I was simple. Didn't watch me as careful after a while. So you escaped." "One night in Cheyenne. Took Blackwood's gun, shot him and 2 others, grabbed their money. They had $5,000 from another robbery. Been running ever since." "You shot Blackwood?" Max frowned. He looked mighty healthy for a dead man. "Got him in the shoulder. Should have aimed better." Despite everything, Max felt the corner of his mouth twitch. The girl had spirit. He'd give her that. "How'd you end up here?" "Been running 2 weeks. Horse died in the storm. Saw your light. Didn't know where else to go." Max studied her face, looking for lies, for manipulation, for anything that might make his decision easier. He saw only exhaustion, fear, and a grim determination that reminded him of soldiers he'd known, men who'd kept fighting long after they should have fallen. "I've got a choice to make," he said finally. "I can turn you over come morning, or—" She waited, her pencil poised over the paper. "Or I can help you disappear. Got a cousin runs a trading post up in Montana Territory. He asks fewer questions than most." Becky stared at him for a long moment, then wrote, "Why would you help a killer?" Max thought of Elizabeth, of the life they'd built here on land that demanded everything and gave back just enough to survive, of the locked room upstairs and the piano that hadn't been played since Fever took the only person who'd ever made music in this house. "Because," he said, rising from the table, "some folks deserve killing and some folks deserve saving, and I reckon you're both." He walked to the stairs, pausing with his hand on the banister. "There's something upstairs I want to show you, something that might help." The key turned stiffly in the lock, and the door swung open with a protesting creak. Dust motes danced in the moonlight that filtered through lace curtains, illuminating Elizabeth's sanctuary, her piano, her music sheets, her small treasures gathering dust in the pale light. "My wife played," Max said simply, his voice rough with memory. Maybe you could try." Becky hesitated on the threshold, as if afraid to enter a place so obviously sacred. Then, drawn by something Max couldn't see, she moved toward the piano, her fingers hovering above the yellowed keys. "Go on," he encouraged. "It's just gathering dust otherwise." Her fingers found the keys like they were coming home. At first, only tentative notes echoed through the room, single keys pressed with careful precision, as if testing whether the instrument might bite back. But then her hands began to move with more confidence, and melody emerged from the dusty silence. Not the careful hymns Elizabeth had played for Sunday service, or the popular songs she'd practiced from sheet music ordered from back east. This was something wild and mournful and beautiful, a song that seemed to rise from the prairie itself, from the wind that howled across empty spaces and the rain that washed away blood and sorrow. Max stood in the doorway, watching this girl who couldn't speak pour her soul through ivory keys. The music told her story better than words ever could. The violence, the grief, the long journey that had brought her to his door. But underneath the sorrow ran a thread of something else. Hope, maybe, or defiance. When the last notes faded, she turned to him with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible but clear as church bells in the morning air. Max felt his own throat close up. "You can speak." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Music. Music was always the key. Even when they—" She gestured helplessly, then placed her hands on the keys again, playing a soft, gentle melody. "This is the first safe place I've been since home." "You don't have to explain," Max said, stepping into the room that no longer felt like a shrine to the dead, but like a bridge between past and future. "We need to get you out of here before dawn. Blackwood won't wait much longer." They worked quickly and quietly, gathering supplies and saddling Max's fastest horse. Becky, or Jessica, though she said she preferred the name he'd given her, moved with purpose now, no longer the silent wraith who'd wandered into his life. "What about you?" she asked as they prepared. Her voice was growing stronger with each word, as if the dam that had held it back was finally crumbling. "Blackwood won't take kindly to being crossed." "I can handle Blackwood," Max assured her, checking his Winchester rifle. "I've dealt with worse." But as pink light began touching the eastern horizon, the sound of approaching horses shattered the pre-dawn quiet. Not from the road, but from the creek side of the property, the direction they'd planned for Becky's escape. "They're cutting us off," Max muttered, grabbing the rifle. "Back inside, quick." They barely made it to the porch when Blackwood and his men emerged from the tree line, rifles ready. There was no pretense of legality now. Their faces were hard with the promise of violence. "Time's up, Colton," Blackwood shouted. "Send out the girl, and maybe we'll let you keep breathing." Max positioned himself in front of the door, rifle raised. "She ain't here, Blackwood. Rode out last night while you boys were warming yourselves by the fire." "Liar," Blackwood spat. "Search the house, boys. Bring her out, And don't be gentle about it. The two men dismounted, spreading out to approach the house from different angles. Max leveled his rifle at the closest one. Not another step. The warning went unheeded. The first shot came from Blackwood himself, splintering wood from the porch column inches from Max's head. Max returned fire, the Winchester's report thundering across the yard. He missed, but the shot was close enough to send Blackwood scrambling for cover behind the water trough. What followed was a chaotic exchange of gunfire. Max managed to wing one of Blackwood's men, sending him limping back toward the trees. But he was outnumbered and soon found himself pinned down behind the porch railing as bullets thudded into the house behind him. A sudden burning pain in his side told him he'd been hit. Not bad, just a graze, but enough to slow him down. He reloaded the Winchester, knowing he couldn't hold out much longer. As he slid fresh cartridges into the rifle, Max realized he might not walk away from this one. Strange, but the thought didn't frighten him as it should have. If this was his day to die, at least it would be for something that mattered, protecting a girl who'd seen too much darkness. Last chance. "Colton!" Blackwood called from behind the trough. "Where is she?" "Go to hell!" Max shouted back, firing again and rewarded with a yelp of pain as his bullet found Blackwood's leg. The marshal's answering shot was better aimed. Max felt the impact like a mule kick to the chest, the force of it slamming him back against the door. The rifle clattered from suddenly nerveless fingers, and he slid down to sit awkwardly on the porch steps, blood spreading across his shirt in a dark stain. Through a haze of pain, he heard Blackwood laugh. "You should have minded your own business, old man." Max tried to reach for his pistol, but his arm wouldn't cooperate. He watched, helpless, as Blackwood limped toward him, drawing a bead with his revolver. The shot that followed didn't come from Blackwood's gun. It came from behind Max, from the doorway where Becky stood with Max's Colt Peacemaker gripped in steady hands. The bullet took Blackwood high in the chest, spinning him half around before he dropped to his knees, a look of confusion replacing his triumphant grin. The second shot hit him between the eyes, and he fell face first into the dirt of Max's front yard. Blackwood's remaining man fired wildly at the house, but Becky was already moving. She stepped over Max, took careful aim, and fired twice more. The outlaw clutched his stomach and dropped his weapon, staggering backward before collapsing beside his horse. The sudden silence that followed seemed louder than the gunfire. "Becky," Max managed, his vision narrowing. "You should have run." She knelt beside him, pressing a hand against his wound. "And leave you to die for me? Not a chance." Her voice was steady now, the words flowing as if they'd never been locked away. "Besides, I'm a better shot than you are." Max tried to laugh, but it turned into a cough that brought the taste of blood to his mouth. Reckon that's true." The world was starting to fade around the edges when the sound of more hoofbeats reached them. Becky raised the Colt again, but lowered it when Sheriff Wilson's voice called out, "Max, what in God's name is happening here?" "Help me get him inside," Becky told the sheriff as he dismounted. "He's been shot." Wilson stared at the bodies in the yard, then at the girl who'd been mute just days ago, now giving orders with the confidence of a general. "You did this?" "They tried to kill us," she said simply. "I stopped them. Now help me save him, or so help me God. I'll shoot you too." The threat was ridiculous coming from a slip of a girl, but something in her eyes, the same cold determination Max had seen when she faced Blackwood, made the sheriff hurry to obey. Wilson hesitated, then pulled out a folded telegram from his pocket. "I've been tracking Blackwood for months. He killed my brother in Kansas. I knew he wasn't a real marshal, but I needed proof before I could act." He looked at the bodies. "Guess I've got it now." Max drifted in and out of consciousness for 3 days. Sometimes he heard Becky's voice, reading from Elizabeth's books, or simply talking to him as she changed his bandages. Sometimes he heard the piano, those haunting melodies that seemed to reach into his chest and hold his heart beating when it might have been easier to let go. When he finally opened his eyes for more than a few seconds at a time, he found Becky dozing in a chair beside his bed, her face young and vulnerable in sleep. He watched her for a moment, marveling at the transformation from the silent, frightened girl to this fierce young woman who had saved his life. "You're staring," she said without opening her eyes. "It's rude." "It's my house," he countered, his voice a dry rasp. "I'll stare if I want to." She smiled then, opening her eyes. "Welcome back, Mr. Colton." "How long?" "3 days. Doc Jenkins didn't think you'd make it the first night, but I told him you were too stubborn to die." Max tried to shift position and winced as pain lanced through his chest. "Blackwood? Dead. His friend, too. Sheriff Wilson's been by every day. He sent wires to Denver and Cheyenne." She hesitated, then added, "They found wanted posters on Blackwood. He was an outlaw just like I said, wanted for bank robbery and murder in 3 territories." "And you?" Max asked. "What about the charges against you?" "Sheriff's working on clearing those. Turns out Blackwood had a lot of enemies who are happy to corroborate my story. The bank in Denver is even talking about a reward for killing him." She shook her head in disbelief. "Imagine that. Getting paid for something I would have done for free." Max chuckled, then immediately regretted it as pain flared again. "So what now? You still heading to Montana?" Becky was quiet for a long moment, studying her hands. "I don't know. For the first time in months, I have choices. Real choices." She looked up at him. "What do you think I should do?" It was Max's turn to consider. He thought about the empty house, the silent rooms, the way her music had filled spaces he'd thought would be hollow forever. He thought about the ranch, too big for one man, but just right for two. He thought about her courage, her resilience, her steady hands with horses and guns alike. "I reckon," he said carefully, "that I could use a permanent hand around here. Someone who knows their way around a barn and can play a decent tune when the work is done. Proper wages, of course, and a roof over your head for as long as you want it." "People will talk," she warned, but he could see the hope in her eyes. "People always talk. Doesn't mean we have to listen." He held out his hand. "What do you say, Miss Daniels? Partners?" She took his hand, her grip firm and sure. "Partners, Mr. Colton." And so Becky stayed. Sheriff Wilson made it official, signing papers that made her Max's legal ward until her 18th birthday, though they both knew she was more employee than child. The scandal died down eventually, as scandals do when there's nothing to feed them. Becky worked as hard as any ranch hand, learning to rope and brand alongside Max's seasonal workers. And in the evenings, she played the piano, filling the old house with music again. 10 years passed. The Colton Ranch prospered, expanding from cattle to horses, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. And Becky, now a confident young woman of 26, opened a small music school in a building Max helped her construct at the edge of the property. She taught the children of neighboring ranchers and a few from town who were willing to make the journey. But her special students, the ones she devoted the most time to, were the orphans from the Millerville home, the damaged ones who found in music what she had, a voice when words failed. On a crisp autumn evening, Max sat on his porch, watching the sun set over land that had seen its share of blood and tears, but now knew more laughter than sorrow. From the music school, he could hear the faint sounds of a piano. Becky teaching one of her students, her voice carrying on the wind as she encouraged and corrected. He thought about the frightened girl with the gun and the woman she'd become. He remembered what he'd told her that night when she'd written that she was a killer. "You're not a killer," he'd said. "You're a survivor." And she had survived. They both had. Not just existed, but lived. Built something worth protecting, worth fighting for. Sometimes, Becky told her students, your voice finds you in the strangest places. Mine found me in a locked room where grief had lived for years. And in saving me, that room and the man who opened it taught me that survival is just the beginning of the story. They say some souls are lost forever in life's storms, and some souls find their way home. But only one thing cannot be stolen by time or tragedy, the music in our hearts. And this was just the beginning of the song. Narrator's voice softens and shifts tone, speaking directly to audience folks. That's our story for today. I hope you enjoyed this journey back to the untamed Wyoming territory of 1878, where men like Max Colton carved out their own brand of justice with nothing but grit, gunpowder, and the occasional helping hand. You know, there's something about these frontier tales that still speaks to us today. Maybe it's the clarity of right and wrong, or maybe it's just the reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for glory, but for the simple chance to build something worth protecting. If you enjoyed Piano on the Prairie, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss next week's story, The Hangman's Pardon, where a former lawman faces the toughest choice of his life when the man he's hunting turns out to be his long-lost son. And for those of you who've been riding alongside me for a while now, I want to thank you. Your comments and support are what keep these campfire tales burning. Until next time, this is Jack Thornton reminding you that the best stories, like the best men, stand tall when the chips are down. See you on the trail.